By now, all your pajama shirt pieces are cut out of the fabric. I'm going to talk about interfacing. Interfacing is an additional layer we sandwich in between collars and cuffs and facings to add stability, especially if there's going to be buttons or buttonholes. I've mailed you a yard of interfacing. And the reason I did that is because what I mailed you is a woven fusible. And that means it has a adhesive on one side. It's a little shinier on one side. It is a woven fabric though. You can see the straighted grain. It has a selvage. I just cut the selvage off because we want to get rid of that. It's densely woven and doesn't have any of the, we're going to cut the selvage edge off. The biggest reason I didn't have you go to the store is because this is called Pellon, P-E-L-L-O-N. It's a manufacturing name, a brand name. And it is a fusible interfacing, but it's not woven. It's like pressed, like felt almost. It doesn't drape. It's very stiff. Cosplayers love it because it's very stiff. I would never use it in a garment. Personally, I would never use it in a garment. And that's why I order the woven fusible interfacing. So this strange shape here on your front of your pajama pattern, this is a self-facing, which means it's all cut out in one piece, but it is going to get folded back and it is going to allow stability to be along the front neck and the center front because that's where your buttons and buttonholes are going to go. It needs to be interfaced, so you are going to take it to the fold line. Hopefully when you cut off that selvage edge, it was a nice, clean, straight line. Now we can trace this out with light pencil, not too heavy. I like to use my clear ruler to give me a straight edge to trace along. I'm following the edge of the pattern, but I'm using the ruler as a straight edge. We're going to need a right and a left, so I'm going to have to flip my pattern piece. As you're working with fusible interfacings, you definitely need an iron, usually a dry iron. You don't use steam. And it can take 20 seconds, 30 seconds to heat up the adhesive that's on the back of this interfacing. Facings can be confusing when you're starting out. But I will try to explain. So this is the collar of a pajama shirt. And you'll notice there's a layer of fabric here on top. And there's also a layer of fabric underneath. So you have a top collar and an under collar. Otherwise, if you just had one layer, there would be a raw edge and it wouldn't have any stability. And between these two layers of collar is a layer of fusible interfacing. And that goes in the collar, and it will be going down the facing, the front facing of your pajama shirt. Blouses and shirts that have cuffs would also have interfacing in there. So once I've cut my first one out, I will flip it over so that I get a facing for each side of my body, a right and a left. You can flip it if you want, because it doesn't have a pattern on it. You just want to make sure that that edge is nice and straight on a straight of grain. Save some of your scrap pieces because we'll be doing tests on the flannel. We're also going to be doing a test collar. That's why I had you cut out 4 collars. If you don't have an iron, please contact me. I have a few I can loan out. They're also available at most drugstores or online or at Target. So there are my facings. I'm straightening up that line. And then I'm going to unfold one of my collars. And I only need one piece of interfacing. The pattern said cut 2 of fabric, cut 1 of interfacing. So the instructions for that are right on your collar pattern. I want to make sure that it is on grain, so I'm looking at my center crease. Because we're making 2 collars, 1 test collar, and then the collar that will go on your shirt, you're going to cut out 2 layers of the interfacing. Now, interfacing adds stability into our collar, but it can also add bulk into the seam allowance. I am going to do some tests with the flannel and the fusible woven interfacing I sent you to see if we have to trim the seam allowance off. So it's going to be the shiny glue side, the adhesive side of our interfacing is going to get fused to the wrong side of our fabric. So for my collar, it would look like this. You are going to lose the markings you put on the collar, so it's important to transfer those dots onto your interfacing. So there's a triangle. I also mark the center back, which is your center fold. We're going to flip just the pattern over. And mark that triangle. So that's, we need those marks. So now I'm going to test my fusible. I may have talked earlier in the class about how when we're ironing wrinkles out, we'll move the iron, we'll smooth the iron over the fabric. When we're pressing, it's the weight of the iron and my hands, the heat of the iron with no steam for this interfacing. So it's heat, weight, and time. So I really do watch a clock and make sure I'm fusing this about 20 seconds. And then I will test it to see if it adhered, and it has. So we're not rubbing the iron back and forth, we're picking it up and placing it in the next spot. And I let 15-20 seconds go by. I lift it up and put it down. That's the difference between pressing and ironing. It's important that you put the shiny side of the interfacing, or the adhesive side, towards the wrong side of your collar or your facing, because if you bring your iron down on the fusible side, it will fuse to your iron. So that seems to work fine. I'm going to do a test to see if it adds too much bulk to my seam. So I've sewn a test piece. One side is interfaced, the other side is not. After it's fused, you can use steam as we continue pressing our seams open. Sometimes I will have you trim off the seam allowance before we fuse it. So I would have you trim off 5/8 inch seam allowance. And that allows the interfacing to stabilize the collar, but not to add any bulk. And I'm going to try that on my test collar. Making sure I can still see my markings. So my first test turned out okay, but it does feel kind of bulky. And we want to make sure that our collars lay smoothly and that they're not stiff. This interfacing seems to need 15 seconds. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew this. So I've sewn it, and I have sewn it, the edge that has our notches, we're leaving that open. We're not sewing that. So that's open. So I started here, I backstitched, I came to the point, I left my needle in the work and pivoted it. I picked up the presser foot so I could pivot it, and then continued sewing along this is the outer edge of the collar. When I got to that point, I pivoted and sewed to here and backstitched. So again, while we're reducing bulk, we're going to cut off the corners, not through the stitching, but close to that pivot point. We are also going to grade the seam allowance. And grading, not like ABCD grading, it's more like when you're grading a road. So the side that we have interfaced, we're trimming that seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. Make sure you're only cutting through one seam allowance. then you're going to trim the other layer of seam allowance a little bit longer or a little bit wider. That reduces the bulk when we turn our collar inside out, right side out. So then I'm going to turn it inside out. No, I'm going to turn it outside out. I'm going to make sure those collar points are nicely turned. The non-interface side is going to be my outer collar. The interfaced layer is going to be my under collar. I hope you can see this. A perfect collar, the edge of that seam is pushed just a little bit inside the faced, the under collar, so that the over collar doesn't have, there's not good words for this, so that the under collar never peaks beyond it's supposed to be tucked away just a 32nd of an inch, if you can see that. In finely tailored garments or very high quality garments, the over collar and under collar are actually cut slightly. The under collar is cut slightly smaller, but that is for another day. So then you'll notice this is my top collar, and the under collar is a little bit, the seam allowance has got off a little bit, but that's actually accurate. So that is what will be the top collar, and there's my under collar. So that's what you're going to be trying for your test collar.